It is the night of the 23rd of December 1888. Inside a house in a little town in France, the air is thick, suffocating, and heavy with a kind of anger that has been boiling over for weeks. Vincent is pacing the floor. The thing that just happened has pushed him into a corner where there is no more room to breathe. Everything he had built in his house, every dream of a brotherhood that might finally settle the storm in his mind, has been torn apart by sharp words and clashing egos. Vincent's hands are shaking with a raw, jagged impulse that demands some kind of release, something that will cut through the suffocating tension that has him trapped. He looks at the tools on his table, his gaze locking onto the cold, sharp glint of a razor. And in that haze of fury, he decides he's going to do something radical to make the noise in his head finally stop. How did Vincent get here? Long before he ever stood in the yellow house in Arles, Vincent was a man haunted by the sensation that he was fundamentally misaligned with the world. A person who tried to fit into the structures of his time, only to find himself shoved back out time and time again. It began with his youth, where he was shuffled into the role of an art dealer at Coupole & a position secured through family connections. It was a career that should have offered him a stable and even prestigious life, but Vincent found it entirely hollow. He was expected to be a salesman, to treat art, the very thing he cared about most, as a commodity to be traded for profit. He couldn't do it. He didn't just dislike the work, he viewed it as a betrayal of everything he held sacred. His inability to feign interest in the commercial side of things, combined with a growing social awkwardness and a tendency to speak his mind, made him a liability. By 1876, the firm had finally had enough, and he was dismissed, leaving him without a profession and, more importantly, without a sense of place in a society that valued conformity above all else. After the failure of the art trade, he stumbled through a series of desperate attempts to find his footing. He took a position as an assistant teacher in a boarding school in England, hoping that the structure of education might anchor him. But it was a low-paying, soul-crushing experience that led nowhere. He moved from there to a bookstore in the Netherlands, only to find himself trapped in a silent, suffocating situation that he despised just as much as the art firm. It was during these years that the rejection began to feel less like bad luck and more like a permanent state of being. He was searching for a way to matter, a way to be useful, and so he turned his eyes toward the church, believing that if he could not find meaning in the world of men, he would find it in the service of God. He threw himself into the theological studies, with the kind of intense, singular focus that would later define his painting. But his lack of discipline and his inability to sit through formal education, preferring to wander the fields and observe the world in its raw, unfiltered state, led to his failure to pass the necessary entrance exams. He was not deterred, however. He traveled to Borinage, a bleak, dangerous coal mining district in Belgium, to act as a lay preacher. This was perhaps the most telling of his early attempts. He lived among the miners, sleeping on straw, giving away his clothes and his money, and literally sharing the poverty of the people he sought to serve. He was so dedicated, so fervently religious, that the locals called him the Christ of the coal mine. Yet even here, in the one place where he felt his devotion matched the reality of human suffering, he failed. The church, unimpressed by his lack of formal training and his erratic, overly emotional style of preaching, decided he was unsuited for the role and refused to renew his contract. A rejection that hit him with the force of a physical wound. Through all of this, his internal landscape remained a place of profound, echoing isolation. He didn't just fail at jobs, he failed at the intimate, quiet parts of life that everyone else seemed to master. He fell in love with a fervor that frightened those he adored, leading to a series of painful, unrequited attachments that left him feeling even more estranged from his own humanity. His only lifeline through all of this turmoil was his younger brother, Theo. Their relationship was the only thing that didn't feel like a mistake, though even that was strained by the crushing reality of Vincent's failure. He was completely dependent on Theo's financial and emotional support, and the guilt of that, the awareness that he was a burden to the one person who truly understood him, only added to the heavy, suffocating pressure that he carried with him. When he finally arrived in Arles, it wasn't just to paint, it was a desperate, final and agonizingly fragile gamble to create a space that he had never been able to find. The Yellow House was his attempt to force the world to be a place where he could belong. A sanctuary where, for the first time, he wouldn't be a failure. And when that dream began to fracture under the weight of his personality and the reality of living with another person, the collapse felt absolute. As if the ground he had been trying to stand on for his entire adult life was finally falling away beneath him. The arrival of Paul Gauguin was supposed to be the coronation of Vincent's long-held dream. For months, Vincent had haunted the streets of Arles, talking to anyone who would listen about his studio of the South. He wanted to drag his fellow artists away from the stale grey air of Paris and into the light of Provence, convinced that if they simply gathered under the same roof, they could spark a renaissance of color and camaraderie. Gauguin, with his rugged worldly air and his reputation as an exotic wanderer who had left the stock exchange to chase art, seemed to Vincent like a titan, a man who had successfully conquered the very demons of middle-class mediocrity that had chewed Vincent up and spat him out. When Gauguin finally stepped off the train in October 1888, the contrast between them was immediate and jarring. Gauguin was the exact opposite of Vincent's desperate, high-strung intensity. He moved with a practiced arrogant stillness, carrying the air of a man who held the world in contempt and found it amusing that anyone will try to impress him. He was older, more cynical, and utterly secure in his own importance. Vincent, by comparison, was a shivering needle of nervous energy, his eyes constantly searching Gauguin's face for a sign of approval, a flicker of warmth, or a nod of validation. He offered up his home as if he were offering up his own skin, scrubbed and painted and prepared for a guest who felt like a savior. But the dream of a brotherhood began to sour almost before the paint on the walls had fully dried. Living in the Yellow House was not the expansive creative bliss Vincent had imagined. Instead, it was more of a claustrophobic experiment in misery. They were two men with diametrically opposed souls trapped in a tight, cramped space. While Vincent attacked his canvases with a frantic, rhythmic violence, layering on thick, pasty paint until the surface pulsed with his own agitation, Gauguin preferred a detached, intellectual approach. He would stand back, watching Vincent work with a smirk that felt like a knife blade, making comments that were designed to prick, to puncture, to remind Vincent that he was not a peer, but a pupil. The deterioration wasn't a sudden event, it was a slow toxic leak that poisoned the house day by day. Every meal they shared became a battlefield. Vincent would talk, his words tumbling over one another in his rush to share his vision, his fears, and his desperate love for the art they both claimed to serve. Gauguin would respond with silence or cutting dismissive irony. He viewed Vincent as a chaotic, unwashed child, a man who couldn't control his emotions, his consumption of absinthe, or the terrifying frequency of his moods. To Gauguin, Vincent was an exhausting chore. To Vincent, Gauguin was the only thing standing between him and total, soul-crushing isolation. And the realization that he could never reach him was like watching the floorboards slowly rot out from beneath his feet. They were both physically wasted, driven by a competitive drive that bordered on the sadistic. They worked until their eyes burned and their hands cramped, fueled by cheap coffee, stronger spirits, and the suffocating pressure of being the only two inhabitants of a world that didn't seem to care if they existed. Every little thing became a weapon. The way Vincent painted, the way he slept, the way he breathed. The dream of the studio of the South was dying, and both of them knew it. The house, which had been a shrine, began to feel like a cage. By the time the night of the 23rd of December arrived, the air in the house was practically electrified with resentment. The triggers were trivial: a difference of opinion on a canvas, a remark about a lack of focus, a long-simmering dispute over money. But the reaction was volcanic. Gauguin, who had grown weary of the constant cloying neediness, the manic highs, and the crushing, bottomless lows, finally reached his limit. He packed his bags. He didn't just decide to leave. He announced it with the cold, final certainty of a man cutting a tether. For Vincent, this was the death knell. His last desperate gamble, his attempt to finally weave himself into a community, to be accepted by a man he truly admired, was evaporating in front of his eyes. To Gauguin, the Brotherhood was a lie. And if the Brotherhood was a lie, then everything Vincent had done, every inch of the ground he had fought for, was a hollow failure. He felt the walls of the Yellow House pressing in on him, the ceiling lowering, the air becoming too thin to sustain him. He was a man drowning, and the only person who could throw him a rope had turned his back to watch him go under. The transition from that argument to the act is a blur of psychological disintegration. Gauguin walked out, the door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was not the quiet of a peaceful night. It was the roar of a total collapse. In that moment, Vincent was alone, not just in the house, but in the universe. Totally alone. The terrified, abandoned child he had been his entire life had finally caught up to the man. The rage that had been a wildfire and had been growing for years finally turned inward, consuming the very last of his defenses. He was no longer thinking about painting or art or his brother or his future. He was in a grip of a dissociation so absolute that the physical world seemed to lose its meaning. The pain in his mind, the noise of 1,000 voices telling him he was unwanted, useless and destined to be alone, became so loud that it had to be silenced. It wasn't an act of grand artistic statement, and it wasn't a calculated sacrifice. There was only the immediate, desperate and devastating need for the storm in his head to finally stop.